So welcome to today's webinar, POS Contactless Experience Best Practices. Hello, my name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the director of the U.S. Payments Forum, an affiliated organization associated with the Secure Technology Alliance, which was formerly known as the Smart Card Alliance. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded today. Also, there'll be time at the end for questions, so we encourage listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard that's available on your screen. And I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A session, and I suggest that you submit your questions while the speakers are presenting so that we have time to review those questions and organize them properly so we can get to as many of them as we have time for. So if we could turn to the next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Payments Forum, here's a brief overview of who we are. So the Forum is a cross-industry body focused on supporting the introduction and implementation of EMV and other new and emerging technologies that protect the security of and enhance opportunities for payments transactions in the U.S. The focus of this organization has really evolved over the last few years, from being singularly dedicated to EMV at its origins and the migration of EMV into the U.S. market, to a much broader focus today on other technologies beyond card and EMV transaction flow. Our work supporting the continued adoption of EMV continues for those late maturing segments of the retail market, such as the petro or fuel industry, transportation and hospitality markets, and the issuer and merchant considerations on testing and certification of EMV contactless and mobile payments, and other contactless issuance and acceptance challenges, which is also the focus of this webinar today. The forum is also focusing on increased attention on education and addressing issues affecting payments that go well beyond EMV, like mobile in-app payment, tokenization, authentication, biometrics, future cardholder verification developments, and emerging standards addressing e-commerce channels like 3D Secure, Secure Remote Commerce, and other fraud mitigation tools that combat card-not-present fraud. Next slide. So the U.S. Forum brings together in an open forum of equals from across the payments ecosystem, leading companies representing global payment brands, financial payment issuers, merchants, processors, debit networks, mobile services providers, and other industry suppliers, integrators, associations, government entities, and transit operators. And this is done through collaboration in work teams on projects that develop resources that assist in the further implementation of EMV, as well as other new and emerging payment technologies through such activities like developing white papers and other educational resources and producing best practices and technical recommendations on evolving standards. We also provide educational programs for our members, as well as share that information with other industry players through webinars, workshops, and at our forum member meetings where we offer tutorials and published resources. We also have an active communications program to do market research with outreach with recommended best practices and industry positions to other influencers who might be impacted by the knowledge and experience that's collected under the forum umbrella. And the organization also provides a great networking opportunity to share knowledge and experience among industry stakeholders to help advance the marketplace. For anyone who might be interested in more information or resources, I invite you to visit the U.S. Payments Forum website at www.uspaymentsforum.org, which is on your screen today. Go to the next slide, please. So currently, the contactless POS experience is very fragmented. Often, consumers are not aware that contactless payments are available. In other implementations, consumers attempt to use contactless payments at locations that have contactless signage, but the transaction is unsuccessful because the terminal does not actually support contactless payments. This webinar will describe best practices for implementing contactless at the point of sale to reduce stakeholder and consumer confusion and help contactless deliver fully on its benefits to merchants, issuers, consumers, and the entire payments ecosystem. Contactless payments, which can be made using enabled cards or mobile wallets, use radio frequency to transmit payment information from a device to the terminal. While many consumers are familiar with making contactless payments with near-field communications enabled mobile wallets, it's less well known that contactless payments can also be made with contactless enabled credit and debit cards. EMV chip cards that have been embedded with an antenna that can be used for contactless, contact chip, or magnetic stripe payments. The discussion about POS contactless experience best practices, being led today by our two presenters, who I'll introduce in a moment, and myself, will begin with a look at the contactless trends that are gaining momentum in the US. We'll also do an examination of some of the recommended best practices for merchants and consumers to make the contactless checkout experience the best it can be for everyone. And we'll address some of the technical challenges that must be overcome to optimize the consumer checkout experience and some recommended solutions for those challenges. Next slide. So now let me introduce today's speakers. TJ Considine leads analytics and issuer support for the global contactless team at Visa and is focused primarily on growing payments in the US. He's excited about the progress the industry has made to date, but knows there is a long way to go before contactless becomes mature in the US market. During his 5 years at Visa, TJ has held a diverse range of roles in marketing, strategy, and product. And TJ joined Visa from Northwestern University, where he majored in chemical engineering. Also today, we have Berkey Baidu, who is Director, Product Management for North American Cyber and Intelligence Solutions at MasterCard. And he manages EMV contact and contactless products in the North American region. He works closely with the industry and MasterCard leadership team to ensure readiness of MasterCard's chip products for the US market. And prior to his current role, he worked in MasterCard's product delivery team, focusing on US EMV migration, and he was part of the MasterCard Acceptance Partners team, which created the framework, working closely with VARs, ISVs, gateways, and software vendors. Baidu has over 19 years of experience in payments industry internationally, and has also been a continuous participant in domestic and international standardization bodies during his career, providing thought leadership. Next slide. So why are we holding this educational webinar now? Well, first, acceptance is maturing. Most point-of-sale terminals installed in the US during EMV migration have the hardware capability to process contactless transactions. In fact, 60% of face-to-face transactions happen at contactless-enabled terminals today. Also, issuance is growing. Several large financial institutions have begun offering contactless cards, including JPMorgan Chase, Capital One, American Express, Discover Network, and Citi. Visa estimates that by the end of 2019, 100 million contactless Visa cards will have been issued in the US. And MasterCard has stated that issuers that represent 73% of MasterCard consumer volume have committed to issuing contactless-enabled EMV cards. And a third reason is that consumers are ready for contactless. Around the globe, it's been shown that consumer adoption flows rapidly once contactless gains critical mass. Additionally, several US transit agencies are moving to open contactless payments acceptance, which is expected to drive consumer habituation for contactless payments activities. Next slide. So what are the benefits of contactless acceptance? Well, merchants will likely see faster throughput at the point of sale, enabling them to serve more consumers faster, as well as likely see incremental spend due to ease of use, mostly coming from small ticket purchases. And note, merchants can still exercise full choice of routing by selecting US Common AID for conducting contactless debit card transactions. Issuers will also likely see increased spend as consumers opt for contactless rather than competing forms of payment. And issuers that issue contactless cards demonstrate payments leadership and innovation to their customers. As contactless sees increasing global momentum, contactless cards offer consistency for use around the world. Contactless cards are more likely to achieve top-of-wallet status, and contactless cards have proven effective in converting cash to card-based payments. Consumers still prefer to use cards over other form factors, and 80% of transactions in the US today still occur in-store, and research supports that consumers want to use cards to pay for those in-store transactions. Contactless tap and pay transactions are simple, quick, convenient, and secure. On average, a contactless transaction is less than a second, much faster than a transaction with a contact chip card or cash. And consumers love contactless cards. For example, 96% of contactless card users in the UK are happy with their experience. Happy, engaged cardholders are more likely to transact more frequently and spend more money. So these headlines, which have appeared in major payments industry publications, highlight some of the major announcements by the global networks, major financial institutions, and mobile wallet schemes about the wave of contactless and mobile payments that are present in the US market and getting larger. Recently, the largest transportation system in the country, New York City, has joined other major transit operations in Chicago, Miami, Philadelphia, Boston, Dallas, to begin accepting bank-issued mobile and contactless payments for transit riders. Developments such as these are only going to accelerate the rate of change in the coming years, which is why the consumer POS experience is so critical for all industry parties to get right. Next slide. So now let me hand things over to TJ Constantine from Visa to talk to you about the point of sale best practices. TJ?
Thank you very much, Randy. So we, as an industry, have done a very good job of laying the foundation for contactless payments in the US. As Randy said, 60% of face-to-face transactions occur at a contactless-enabled merchant. And that means that 60% of the time a consumer walks into a store today, they could tap if they had that form factor available to them. Additionally, Visa is on track to issue more than 100 million contactless cards this year and expects to have 300 million contactless cards in force by the end of 2020. So we've done a really good job laying the foundation. But in order to ensure that contactless delivers on its promise of fast, seamless, and secure transactions at the point of sale, it's critical that we ensure that consumers have a consistently good experience at the point of sale. Next slide, please. This comes down to a handful of things. And fundamentally, the most important is that consumers should know that they can tap through clear and consistent signage. If consumers do not know that they can tap, they're not going to. The point of sale terminals should communicate when and where to tap during the transaction. Consumers should receive a confirmation that their card was read, and then an approval or decline message on the terminal. And retail cashiers should be familiar with the experience for contactless payments, as retail clerks and cashiers really are kind of the front line of making this transition to contactless payments. If all of these best practices are followed, merchants will be able to offer consumers a fast, easy, and secure checkout experience that delivers on consumer expectations of seamlessness and convenience and leaves consumers with a favorable impression of their shopping experience. Now let's talk through some common problems that we're seeing at the point of sale, along with their solutions. Next slide, please. Now the first one, and really this is the most critical, is how does a consumer know that contactless can be used? Nearly half of consumers today are not sure which merchants and where they can tap for contactless cards and mobile wallets. Merchants have several avenues to communicate this message to consumers. The first and really the easiest is that merchants should display the EMVCo contactless symbol, which is pictured on the right, as it's required by some brands, and they should display it prominently on the terminal and or during the checkout experience. And this is a key point. The symbol should be displayed before the consumer begins the checkout experience, because consumers usually decide how they are going to pay before they're actually prompted on the screen. So if they do not see this symbol, even if it says tap or insert or swipe, it's very likely they still insert the card because they didn't know until it was too late that they could tap. The second methodology that merchants can use to communicate contactless acceptance is the terminal display by prompting consumers to tap, insert, or swipe. Additionally, many merchants already display mobile wallet acceptance marks. While these do indicate that consumers can tap, consumers do not necessarily associate these symbols with the acceptance of contactless enabled cards. The EMVCo symbol is inclusive of both cards and mobile wallets and should always be displayed as the baseline for contactless acceptance, regardless of any other marks on the screen. Lastly, and this is pretty intuitive, but merchants that do not accept contactless payments should not display the EMVCo contactless symbol, because this leads to consumer confusion at the point of sale. Next slide. Now, when during a transaction should a consumer tap? And consumers often are unsure because sometimes the prompts on the screen can be confusing. Now, fundamentally, this depends on the integration of EMV that the merchant is using, and it depends on certain other factors. But there are two implementation methods that are generally used that influence when a consumer can tap for contactless payments. Those are traditional EMV and faster EMV. Faster EMV is known as quick chip, at least among the Visa community. In both implementations, it is a best practice that the terminal should prompt consumers to tap and be ready to receive the tap at the same time with all other acceptance interfaces, including swipe and insert. Traditional EMV requires the final total amount to be sent to the terminal before consumers can tap or insert, whereas faster EMV allows consumers to tap or insert before or in parallel to the tender being totaled. Please note, the placeholder value used in pre-tap can impact the merchant choice of AIDs and CVMs. Some terminals require cashier action before consumers are able to pay, i.e. the terminal needs to be turned on. As implementations may vary, it is beneficial for the consumer experience and a best practice to have all payment interfaces, magstripe, contact chip, and contactless, enabled at the same time, rather than requiring a separate action to enable contactless. Next slide, please. Where on the terminal should a consumer tap? And this is a common problem where consumers are trying to tap on the EMVCo contactless symbol, and that's actually not the best place to place the card. So consumers should be prompted to tap their card or device to the location on the terminal that is in the optimal reading position. That's intentionally vague because the optimal reading point varies depending on the terminal manufacturer and model. However, EMVCo mandates that the antenna wrap around the display on pin pad models, so very commonly the optimal reading point is in the middle of the display. EMVCo also requires the optimal location to light up when it's ready to accept payments. In some older models, the optimal reading location may be a somewhat obvious external attachment to the top of the terminal. To ensure that consumers are tapping at the proper location, terminal vendors and merchants should align the EMV code contactless symbol with the optimal location on the terminal, since consumers most often tap their card or device to where the symbol is. Next slide. Now, what do cashiers need to know? And this is actually super critical. And I'll share a quick story that really illustrates this. Last weekend, I was at a local hardware store, and I walked up to the terminal, and it was a somewhat older model without any clear signage. And as I got ready to pay, the clerk looked at my card and said, "Oh, you have one of those tap-to-pay cards." And being curious and somewhat disingenuous, I said, "Oh, what's that?" He looked at the card and said, "These are really cool. You can tap them rather than inserting. It's way faster." So again, being curious, I asked how he knew. And he said that the manager of that store had just introduced the concept and said, "Hey, just so you know, you can use mobile payments or contactless cards at this terminal." And the clerk was very excited about that and said that he often told consumers that their card was contactless enabled without them even knowing. So that just illustrates how critical clerk training and education is to ensuring that the consumer experience is consistently good. Cashiers should be able to articulate to consumers when during a transaction they are able to tap, where on the terminal they should tap, and whether the transaction has gone through. They should be trained on their specific point of sale solutions because they do vary from merchant to merchant. Next slide, please. Now, the best practices for the consumer transaction flow, just to sum everything up. First, the terminal displays the contactless symbol so that consumers know that they can tap. Second, the terminal prompts consumers to tap, insert, or swipe when the payment is ready to be accepted. Third, the terminal indicates that a payment has gone through with either a light or a beep. And fourth, the terminal communicates that the transaction is complete. If those 4 steps are followed, contactless will be able to deliver on its promise of fast, easy, and secure transactions at the point of sale. Next slide. And with that, I will hand it over to Berkey to talk through some common technical questions and solutions.
Thank you, TJ, and hello, everybody. As we're moving towards being a contactless market, there are, of course, technical questions raised. In this section, we'll try to address most common questions and offer solutions to these questions. Next slide, please. Let's start with how to, the technical terminal and configuration challenges and how to overcome these challenges. So when implementing contactless, merchants may run into several common technical challenges. Typically, these fall into 2 categories: technical interaction challenges and sorts of consumer confusion. The white paper goes into detail of each of these points, which we will summarize here. As we start with the technical configuration challenges, the first one is, what if consumers tap too early? So this may be caused by the consumer tapping before the payment terminal is available to accept the payment. This will require cardholder to tap again once the terminal is ready to accept the payment. A way to resolve this is to clearly communicate on the terminal where and when to tap to the cardholder. The second challenge is if the mobile device or card is not being properly read. This may be because the contactless symbol is not placed at the optimal reading point, or there's another factor obstructing the signal. The merchant may want to reposition the symbol on the device to the optimal read point. So as TJ mentioned before, it may, for the newer terminals with the largest screens, it's in the middle of the screen, so you may want to have the signage on the screen itself, or if it's somewhere else, you have to clearly identify where it is. So the third challenge is, the read method conflicts at the terminal. There may be read conflicts. Mobile phones have transmitters in different locations, which makes it difficult for merchants to standardize the payment experience on top of it. So some read very well, some consumer devices may read very well on top of the device, others in the middle or elsewhere. So some terminals may pick up the NFC signal while swiping due to swipe proximity to the NFC antenna. This is most common on smaller devices and MPOS systems. Antenna could pick up the NFC signal from any phone as below the counter as well. So a resolution for this would be to use a terminal stand to increase the difference between the counter and the mobile device. So the terminal will be away from any other external factors. Next slide, please. So next, points which may create consumer confusion. The first one is placeholder amount displayed on mobile device before final amount is known. This happens in some older versions of mobile phones, and they may be showing the placeholder amount during the tap instead of the final transaction amount. So mobile wallets shouldn't do this. The second point of confusion for cardholders is loyalty programs sometimes may require additional taps. So the cardholder may not know whether they're tapping for a payment or for a loyalty part of the transaction to be processed. So we recommend clear messaging on the device as well as consumer education about loyalty program and how it should be used at the point of sale. And lastly, mobile phones are going to act different than cards during a payment processing. Meaning phones themselves provide some feedback to the cardholder by beeping or vibrating. However, the cards don't have such functionality built into them. So terminals using audible and visual messaging to the consumer should alleviate any confusion here. Next slide, please. So all in all, final thoughts on contactless POS best practices for you as we conclude this webinar. Using clear and consistent messages on the POS will signal to the consumer where and when to tap. Additionally, consumers should receive visual and audible confirmations when their card or device has been accepted and whether the transaction was approved or declined. Good communication with the consumer is the key. Lastly, don't forget how important cashiers are. Ensure they have training and understand how contactless transactions work. With this, let's go back to Randy for closing.
Great. Thank you, Berkey, and thank you, TJ. So before we take your questions, and now will be a good time to start submitting them, I'd just like to share some additional resources and events that are available from the U.S. Payments Forum. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So if you would like to become more informed about payments implementation trends, such as contactless and EMV, as well as other technologies, and you're one of the stakeholders groups that I mentioned early in my introduction, you should consider joining the U.S. Payments Forum. The next meeting of the U.S. Payments Forum will be held on November 20th and 21st in St. Louis, and this is one of 3 in-person meetings that are hosted by the U.S. Payments Forum throughout the year. Also, if you're a merchant or a financial institution and not currently a member of the forum, please contact me about the availability of receiving a free guest pass to attend your first U.S. Payments Forum meeting. The white paper that this webinar was based on is available at the information portal on the uspaymentsforum.org website, and the link is provided for you here below. It's free and accessible for non-members, and there are many other valuable resources available there that have been produced by other working committees and other project teams over the course of the years. And we would encourage you to review those resources and share them with your other industry colleagues. So if we can go to the last slide, Kathy, I'm going to leave our contact information up there in case anybody would like to contact us after this webinar for any further information. And we'll now go to the Q&A session. So the first question, maybe this one for TJ, what is the single most critical action a merchant can take to improve the contactless POS experience?
Thanks, Randy. So as I mentioned during my presentation, the lowest hanging fruit and the first thing a merchant should do is display the EMVCo contactless symbol. Awareness of this symbol is growing. I think it passed 55% last quarter among general U.S. consumers. So, there still is a long way to go before everyone understands what it is and what it means, but we're getting there. And that is the clearest and cleanest way that you can communicate to consumers that they can tap their card or phone. Thank you.
Thanks, TJ. Berkey, you could take this next one. Some merchants use screen protectors. What, if any, problems would a screen protector cause with contactless reads or a POS vendor antenna tuning consideration?
So I personally haven't heard any issues with screen protectors since they're mostly plastic and they don't obstruct the signal. But if they're experiencing, if you're experiencing any issues with your terminals in terms of how they perform contactless transactions, it may be wise to try transactions without screen protectors to see if there is any obstruction of signal. There are other possible reasons why there may be obstruction of signals, such as terminal may be very close to another metal device, or as I mentioned, it may be too low on the counter, then it may be receiving signals from nearby electronic devices. So using a stand will help with all the other factors as well.
Thank you, Berkey. Let's see. I'm not sure this question will be for either TJ or Berkey, but what is the placeholder amount and how is it different from the total amount in a contactless transaction?
I can answer if you like. So I believe, as TJ mentioned, there are two types of transactions in contactless. One is standard contactless transaction, which starts after the final amount is known. The second way of implementing contactless is what we call faster EMV solution. Faster EMV solution allows the cardholder to tap their card at any time of the checkout experience without waiting for the checkout to complete. So if you think about a multi-lane environment in a grocery store, it allows the cardholder to tap while the goods are being scanned. So for such implementation, a placeholder amount is used by the terminal, and it may be an arbitrary, it's an arbitrary amount, basically. It may be $1, 10 cents, $10, whatever merchant decides is appropriate for their environment. So that amount is called, a placeholder amount, and in some cases it's displayed on the mobile devices. That's, we are recommending mobile devices to not display that amount, and larger mobile devices have already made changes to not display that placeholder amount during checkout experience.
Great. TJ, maybe you could take this one. How do differences between cards and mobile wallets affect the way merchants should set up their point of sale terminal?
Thanks, Randy. So fundamentally, the transactions work in the same way. They communicate with the terminals in the same way. And by and large, if you accept mobile wallets, you accept contactless cards. There are a couple key differences that merchants should be aware of, and it does affect how you set up your terminals. If you think about it, when you pay with your phone, you have a device in your hand that gives you some sort of feedback, either haptic or audio, that tells you when the device and the terminal connected. And then it potentially even tells you when the transaction is complete. And so it reduces the burden on the terminal itself. With cards, you don't actually have that. The card is not going to vibrate or beep or anything. And so that is why it's critical that terminals communicate to a consumer with either lights or audio or whatever it is that the card has communicated with the terminal and the payment is now processing. If the terminal doesn't do this for cards, consumers may feel like they need to hold the card against the terminal for a much longer time than they actually do, especially in places where the connection is sort of slow or the terminal is not running as quickly as it normally does. And if a consumer is standing there with their card against the terminal for 2 or 3 seconds, it sort of defeats the purpose of contactless payments, because at that point, the time difference and the perception difference isn't that great between tapping your card and inserting it. So as merchants are thinking about how to set up their terminals, understand that for mobile, the onus really does come down to the phone on communicating with the consumer. But with cards, the terminal needs to do it instead.
Thank you. Berkey, a technical question. Any issue or reported failures to tap on the POS with the use of metal payment cards?
Great question. So all the terminals basically go through the standard level 1, level 2, level 3 EMV testing before they are implemented in the field. So that makes sure they are operating within determined operating thresholds and can communicate with devices. So metal cards, because once they're very different kind of metal cards. Some are performing better than others, but if you some of these cards have one face full metal, which basically causes some stress on the signal and doesn't allow the card to operate using that side of the card. But the other side is generally covered with PVC, and that side would be allowed. So in most cases, metal cards may need to be a little closer to the terminal. So telling the customers to tap their cards instead of hovering their cards over the terminal is a good countermeasure for overcoming that kind of signal distance kind of problems. And if a card doesn't work, you may ask the card holder to turn the card around and tap, because they may be trying to tap a metal card which cannot operate on the metal side itself.
And this is TJ. Just to add on to that, in terms of actual results, to date, we haven't seen any major differences between use of contactless on metal cards versus use of contactless on plastic. So while there are read range challenges, like Berkey said, in effect and in practice, consumers are still tapping them, and the approval rates are still right in line with where they should be. So this definitely was a concern of ours when these cards were rolled out, but it turns out that our concerns were mostly inflated and unnecessary.
Yeah, and I just got a quick note from one of our informed industry experts from the forum who does mention that some metal cards are designed to only be tapped on one side, but other cards can be tapped on both sides. So it could be an issuer by issuer difference. Okay. Question, Berkey. Should merchants implement contactless experience differently than compared to how they have set up for contact cards?
Definitely. So the promise of contactless is a very quick tap and go type of transaction versus in EMV, it's more like insert and wait until the end of the transaction and then remove the card. So as we're promising the cardholder a very quick and convenient and secure transaction experience, the contactless flows should be taught separately from contact EMV experience when it comes to how the terminal transacts. So in an EMV contact environment, the merchant may be asking loyalty-related questions, email entry, etc. But as you would agree, those additional questions that are added into the checkout flow basically adds more steps and more friction to the experience. So if you do the same thing in a contactless transaction, it would basically make the transaction take much longer and make it more similar to a contact transaction. So you wouldn't likely benefit from the contactless experience as you should be with just implementing tap and go. So I think it's very important for merchants to think contactless as a different type of experience for the cardholder, and decide what they would like their cardholders to experience when they tap, what would be the most beneficial for their cardholders, and design the experience from that perspective. And they may end up having a totally separate transaction flow from what they have on the contact side.
Thank you. Are there any requirements for entering a PIN for using a contactless card?
So contactless cards work just as contact cards, right? So there is the concept of CVM limits in contactless environments. So CVM limit means over which transaction amount the terminal will initiate, CVM, so cardholder verification, and under which amount the terminal won't do cardholder verification. So for credit card transactions, some networks have CVM limits set. So the terminals will do a CVM-less or no CVM transaction under that limit. So even if the card requires PIN, it won't ask. The terminal won't ask for a PIN. For over CVM limit, the full CVM processing will take place. For debit, the merchant controls basically the experience because their German and routing choices comes into place. So the merchant decides the CVM limits for debit transactions, and still based on how the terminal is configured, as the terminal and supports PIN and the card supports PIN entry, the merchant will ask for PIN, based on all the factors together.
TJ, this sort of a related question. In other countries, there's a floor limit where contactless cards have to be inserted after a certain dollar value or transaction volume before it can be processed. Does that exist in the U.S.?
That does not. So that is due to a fundamental difference in how EMV is processed in those countries and how PIN is received. So several of those countries, like Canada and the UK, require you to insert your card above a certain amount. And it's related to what Berkey said about CVM limits. So they require a CVM above the £30 and 100 Canadian dollar threshold. And because those markets are offline PIN, meaning the PIN is validated by the card, and so it's a relationship between the card and the terminal, you can't actually do that with contactless. Technically you could. It would require you to hold the card against the terminal as you enter in your PIN. But for all intents and purposes, it's impractical. The US is an online PIN market, which means that the PIN is validated between the terminal and the issuer. So you enter your PIN, the PIN is sent to the issuer and it's validated. So you don't actually need to continue that interaction between the card and the terminal. So all of that to say, you can enter a CVM with contactless. And so you can tap to any amount, regardless of whether you're prompted for a CVM or not.
Okay. A question came in about wearable technologies like Apple Watches. Do merchants need to do anything special in programming their terminals to enable the acceptance of an Apple Watch?
I can answer no. So as you know, TJ also pointed out earlier, so the universal contactless symbol indicates universal acceptance of contactless, and it doesn't differentiate between cards versus mobile phones versus wearables. So they all use the same technology. That's a very important point to educate our cashiers on as well. That if one of the technologies are accepted, so when you see the universal contactless symbol, that means all of these technologies, all of the phones and wearables are as well accepted as well as cards. So there's no separate development necessary to accept a particular type of contactless device.
Okay. TJ, I think this is a Visa question for you. Can merchants implement both traditional EMV and quick chip, or can only one version be implemented in the terminal?
I'm not sure I totally know the answer to that. Using deductive reasoning here because of the way they work, I think that you can only implement one. Quick chip uses a placeholder amount. It captures more information in the transaction flow and the interaction with the card right up front than traditional EMV does. So I believe if you implement quick chip or faster EMV, you don't also have full EMV at the same time. It's sort of a one or the other situation.
So does either of you have any pointers for merchants who want to implement the use of the U.S. Common Debit AID with contactless?
So Randy, as you mentioned during the webinar, U.S. Common AID and routing options are protected with contactless. So these are still EMV cards. On a debit contactless card on the contactless interface, you still have a global AID and a US common AID. And merchant uses the same logic as they use on the contact interface to filter the candidate list and select US common AID as if that's the desire of the merchant. So the same logic, the same algorithm, and same rules apply to contactless transactions that already apply on the contact interface.
Okay, next question. I know we are talking about POS terminals today, but have you seen many banks using tap to pay on their ATM machines accepting contactless cards?
Not in a wide scale way yet. I know that several international countries do have these or that technology, but in the U.S., primarily it's been for on-us ATM transactions, and more often it's been focused on mobile than card. That said, the capability exists, and we know that several issuers and networks are in discussions to roll some of these things out. Contactless doesn't quite have the same value proposition for an ATM transaction as it does for a point of sale transaction. So it'll likely happen over a longer period of time. But we do think that that will eventually happen here in the US.
Yeah, I would note that the U.S. Payments Forum has an ATM working committee, and they have been looking at contactless as well as cardless acceptance of payments at ATM machines and coming up with some best practices and recommendations to support that as well. Why does the U.S. lag behind other countries in availability of contactless technology? Anybody want to take that one?
I can take that one. The U.S. was a late adopter of EMV, and we were a late adopter of EMV because it wasn't fully necessary until much more recently than it was in places like France or Australia. And in every market around the globe, there has been a two-step migration from magstripe to EMV and then to contactless. It's sort of like, you have this counterfeit fraud problem and you solve it, but in effect you drop something on your foot, and contactless is the aspirin to take away the pain from your foot. So in every market around the globe, it's required a two-step migration. And we did have discussions in 2014 or 2015 about jumping straight to contactless, and we ultimately decided it was impractical because time was of the essence. There were major cybersecurity events that we wanted to make sure did not fully disrupt and become major fraud incidents. And so getting EMV cards in consumers' hands and getting EMV terminals at merchants was really critical. And going straight to contactless would likely have added 6 months to a year at least. And we decided it wasn't worth that delay, and we would solve that problem later.
Okay, we are almost out of time. I think we got time for one or more questions left. So if anybody has a burning question, now would be a good time to submit it. This question came in, will mobile wallets include some type of indicator in the transaction information that identifies the name of the wallet or the source of the mobile wallet transaction?
So in the tokenized transactions on my side, in the response message, there goes a wallet identifier, so the merchant knows what the actual type of wallet is transacting. And I believe the mobile working committee has a white paper on this very topic.
Yeah, I can comment on that. We are in the final stages of releasing a white paper from the U.S. Payments Forum that talks about the additional data elements that are, in fact, we just released that, I think, the additional data elements that are available to merchants when mobile wallets are used in the point of sale. So if you're not familiar with that, please visit the U.S. Payments Forum website for more information on that. Okay, well, thank you all for this great Q&A session, and I want to especially thank TJ Constantine from Visa and Berkey Baidu from MasterCard, as well as the team from the U.S. Payments Forum who developed the white paper on which this webinar was based, and the content for today's webinar that was supported especially by Lori Braitzky from FIS Global and Beatriz Gonzalez from PAX. So thank you all for your contributions today. Today's webinar has been recorded, as I mentioned at the beginning, and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. You will receive an email with a link where you can listen to the recording and download the presentation. And we encourage you to share that link and that information with others in your organization who were not able to participate in today's webinar, so more people have access to that information. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you all and have a great day.